So picture this. You are interacting with your bank or maybe some software provider you really rely on for work.
Oh, we have all been there.
Right. And their marketing, it talks a really big game about how much they value you, the customer. They've got the slick ads, the friendly slogans, the absolute promise of this like seamless, frictionless journey.
Yep, the dream scenario.
Exactly. But then you actually try to use their service, you run into a snag, and suddenly you're bouncing between 3 different departments.
Oh, yeah, it's the
You
worst.
have to re-explain your problem to like 4 different people. The app crashes when you try to update your payment method, and the whole experience just feels utterly disjointed. You just sit there wondering how a company that clearly spends millions on branding can be so spectacularly bad at actually delivering on it.
It is honestly one of the most common frustrations in modern life. And it points to a really profound disconnect between, corporate intention and everyday reality.
Which is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, ready to dig into this massive headache.
And I'm your expert for today, ready to help unpack the mechanics behind why this happens.
So for this deep dive, we are looking at a really fascinating piece of source material. It's an article called Service and UX Design, a practical response to CX challenges.
Yeah, written by Tobias Reidenhag. He's the head of design at Intunio, which is this Swedish digital design and development studio.
And the mission here today is to take customer experience, or CX, which, let's be honest, has become this unavoidable corporate buzzword, and actually demystify it. We want to uncover why it so often fails, even though literally everyone in the business world agrees that it's super important.
Everyone agrees it matters, but executing it is a whole different story.
Right. So to frame the core problem, I was thinking about it like this. It's like buying a ticket for a luxury train journey based on this gorgeous, glossy brochure. That brochure is the company's ambition, right?
Okay, I like this analogy.
But then, halfway through the trip, the train just jolts to a halt because the people who built the beautiful dining car, they never actually spoke to the people who laid the iron tracks. The tracks just don't connect.
That's a great way to put it. The train brochure is a really helpful starting point. But in the corporate world, the reality is usually a lot messier.
How so? Like, messier than disconnected tracks.
Well, yeah, because the kitchen or the tracks in this scenario, they aren't just built by different people. They are managed by totally different departments, often spread across multiple time zones.
Brilliant.
And they're usually running on these clunky legacy software systems that literally cannot communicate with one another. So to understand why those tracks don't connect, we really have to look at how organizations traditionally misunderstand the very concept of customer experience.
Let's start with that definition then.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, it seems like every company has a slightly different idea of what CX actually means. Some think it's just customer service. Others think it's like pure marketing.
And that fragmentation right there is the root of the whole issue. At its core, customer experience is the total package.
The whole thing.
Right. It is how a customer experiences an organization over time as a continuous, unbroken whole. It encompasses the physical products, the digital interfaces, the marketing communication, the technical support, the billing process, all of it.
Because the customer doesn't see those as separate departments, do they?
Yeah.
They just see them as one ongoing relationship with one single entity.
Exactly. You don't think I'm talking to the billing team. You think I'm talking to the company.
But I'm stuck on one thing here, though.
Yeah.
If the definition of customer experience is that comprehensive, and the goal of keeping the customer happy is that obvious, why do the exact same problems keep popping up everywhere?
It's a fair question.
Like you see this in tech and healthcare, retail. Are companies just incompetent? Or is it like a cynical marketing ploy where they just don't actually care about you once they have your money?
It is incredibly tempting to assume bad faith when you're on the receiving end of a terrible experience.
It really is.
But the reality is rarely about apathy. It's almost never the case that no one in the building cares. The failure usually comes down to structural gaps within the organization itself.
Structural gaps. What does that mean in practice?
Well, in a modern enterprise, CX is very often owned at a super high executive level. So you have executives in boardrooms setting goals, looking at broad metrics, and mapping out these highly idealized customer journeys on whiteboards.
Right. So they're the ones writing the glossy train brochure.
Exactly. But they aren't the ones actually building the train. The execution of those executive goals is scattered across dozens of disconnected teams, way further down the organizational chart.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Yeah, you have a marketing team focused entirely on acquisition. You have a product development team running on, agile sprints. You have an IT operations team just trying to maintain legacy databases.
And none of them are talking to each other.
Right. And then you have a customer support team at the end of the line, just trying to handle the fallout. Because of this massive structural divide, CX ends up being mapped and measured at the very top, but it is rarely built into the everyday decisions of the people doing the ground level work.
So, like, the marketing team creates this flawless ad campaign promising a 2-minute setup, right?
Yeah.
But they have no idea that the DevOps team hasn't fully integrated the legacy database with the new mobile app API.
Yes, precisely.
So the user actually has to wait 24 hours for account approval, completely ruining the 2-minute promise.
That is a perfect example of how these silos operate, and the source material gets quite specific about the symptoms of this disconnect. Because the execution is so distributed, you get teams that are only optimizing their own specific silos.
They're just looking at their own little piece of the pie.
Right. So the marketing team hits their KPI for signups, and they celebrate. The DevOps team hits their metric for server uptime, and they celebrate. But the customer transitioning between those two silos, they experience massive friction.
That brings up a really interesting dynamic regarding incentives, actually. Because if marketing gets bonuses for sheer volume of signups, but support gets penalized for a high ticket volume,
Oh, absolutely.
those departments are structurally opposed to each other. They aren't just disconnected. Their goals are actively fighting each other.
And that leads to perhaps the most common symptom highlighted in the text, which is customer support being forced to compensate for underlying structural failures.
Oh, man. Support always get thrown under the bus.
They really do.
Yeah.
When the underlying systems clash, companies often just throw human labor at the problem. Support literally becomes a band-aid for bad organizational architecture.
Right. Instead of fixing the broken database integration, they just hire a bunch of really apologetic customer service reps to handle all the angry phone calls.
Exactly. But from the customer's perspective, it doesn't matter at all where the internal responsibility sits. The customer doesn't care that the billing department uses a totally different software system than the IT department.
No, they just know the company as a whole is failing them.
That's the crux of the issue. The customer perceives the experience as a whole, even when the organization is deeply, deeply divided. So if the customer feels it as one continuous journey, trying to fix just one isolated problem in one isolated department is never going to work.
Right. Fixing the billing software in a vacuum won't help if the initial onboarding is still broken.
Exactly. It's a holistic problem.
Which means we need a way to look at the entire system. If executive boardroom mandates aren't working and siloed optimizations aren't working, how do companies actually rebuild the foundation? Like, what is the actual mechanism for fixing this?
This is where the source material introduces a really critical concept, service design.
Service design. Oh.
Yeah, the author, Tobias Breitenhag, positions service design not as some extra optional layer that you just sprinkle on top of a CX strategy. Rather, service design is the foundational element that makes customer experience possible to realize in the first place.
So it's the structure.
Right. It is the behind-the-scenes machinery.
Okay, so we talked about a restaurant analogy earlier, just before we started recording, actually, where CX is how the diner feels at the end of the meal, right? And service design is the kitchen layout, the supply chain, the flow of the servers.
Yes, that's a perfect way to visualize it.
But as you mentioned earlier, that's kind of the 101 version.
Yeah.
In a massive enterprise, the kitchen is spread across multiple time zones and runs on conflicting software systems. So how does someone actually do service design in that kind of complex environment? What does that machinery look like in practice?
Well, doing service design means really mapping out the internal blueprint of the company and fundamentally redesigning how the pieces fit together. It focuses on all those invisible elements that the customer never sees.
The stuff behind the curtain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A service designer will audit the internal processes, they'll clarify the ownership of tasks, evaluate the system support, and map the actual data handoffs between different teams.
So they're the ones looking at that exact scenario we just talked about, where the CRM doesn't talk to the app's API. They map that out and say, look, here's where the data gets trapped. Here's where the user experience breaks.
Exactly. They look at the flow of information. Let's say a user updates their physical address in a mobile app. Does that address automatically update in the marketing database so they stop getting localized ads for their old city?
Oh, right. Good point.
Does it update in the billing system so their credit card doesn't suddenly get declined? Service design is the hard, honestly unglamorous work of ensuring those internal pipes are actually connected.
It sounds super tedious, but entirely necessary.
It is. And it also involves aligning those opposed KPIs we discussed. A service designer might advocate for shared metrics across marketing and support, so both teams are financially incentivized to create a smooth onboarding process rather than just hitting their own siloed targets.
That makes a lot of sense. You're fundamentally rewiring how the company operates so that it can actually deliver on its promises.
Yes.
And the source notes that when this behind-the-scenes service design is missing, high-level CX ambitions just risk stalling completely. They just remain like ambitions on a whiteboard.
Yeah, without service design, you essentially have a blueprint for a house, but no plumbers or electricians to actually make it livable. But when the service design is solidly in place, the experience can be shaped in a way that holds up over time, even within those highly complex organizations. It creates a genuinely resilient structure.
Okay, but a user doesn't log into an app and interact with an API integration, right? Or the KPI spreadsheet, or an internal data handoff. They interact with the screen, they click buttons, they read text.
Right, the front end.
So how do we transition from this invisible behind-the-scenes structure to the actual thing the user touches?
That tangible touch point is what we call user experience design, or UX.
Okay, UX.
If service design is the invisible machinery, the article explains that UX design is where the customer experience actually becomes tangible to the user. UX handles the interfaces.
The actual buttons and screens.
Yeah, it's the specific flows on a screen, the feedback loops when you click a button, the visual hierarchy, the clarity of the copy. It is that immediate, visceral moment where a user tries to accomplish a task and instantly decides, does this work or not?
Okay, going back to the restaurant, UX is the plating of the food. It's the weight of the silverware. In the digital space, it's the app on my phone, the location of the checkout button, how quickly the page loads.
Exactly. It is the immediate point of contact. It is the translation of all that complex back-end machinery into a simple, intuitive interaction for the human being on the other side of the screen.
Wait, okay. But if the whole back end is broken and the silos are a mess like we talked about, then hiring some hotshot UX designer to build a slick app is basically useless.
You hit the nail on the head.
Because you can't UX your way out of a foundational data silo. You're just putting a nice coat of paint on a crumbling house.
That is precisely the trap that so many organizations fall into. They think they have a CX problem, so they hire a UI or UX agency to redesign their website or their app. But the expert insight from Intunio is very, very clear on this. UX cannot carry CX on its own.
It just can't hold the weight.
It is structurally impossible.
Yeah.
You can have the strongest, most thoughtfully designed user interface in the world, but if the underlying dependency between the internal systems creates friction, the whole thing just shatters.
Can you give an example of how that plays out? Like, how does a great UX fail because of bad service design?
Okay. Think about a beautifully designed ride-sharing app. The UX is flawless, right?
Yeah.
The map is responsive, the animations are super smooth, the driver tracking is accurate to the second.
Sounds great so far.
Right. But let's say you get overcharged for a ride, so you click the wonderfully designed help button in the app, but because the company's internal silos are disconnected, that button boots you out of the app entirely and opens this clunky, ugly web browser.
Oh, I hate when that happens.
And you are forced to log in a second time because the web portal doesn't share authentication with the mobile app. Then you are dumped into a chat with a bot that doesn't even know your name or your recent trip history, all because the customer support software isn't integrated with the ride tracking database.
Oh man, that is painfully relatable.
Yeah,
In that moment, the gorgeous app didn't save the experience at all. The illusion of the seamless journey is completely, totally broken.
exactly. The source makes it clear that optimizing a single screen is practically useless if the overall journey is fractured. UX works best, and in fact only truly works, when it is supported by those clear processes and structures we discussed earlier.
When the foundation is actually there.
Right. When service design provides a solid foundation, when the data flows freely and the internal handoffs are clear, then UX can contribute to an experience that is not just good for 5 seconds on a screen, but remains consistent and reliable over the lifetime of the customer's relationship with the brand.
Okay, so if service design handles the back-end structure, the data flows, and the internal organizational handoffs, and UX handles the front end, the interfaces, and the tangible touch points, Then what exactly does a chief CX officer even do?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because where does the customer experience department fit into all of this? It sounds like CX isn't actually a job you can do in a vacuum.
And that is the exact realization that requires a massive paradigm shift in how the corporate world operates. And it brings us to the core philosophy of Intunio.
Right, the studio from the article.
Remember, they are a digital design and development studio. They deal with these structural failures every single day. The author points out that at Intunio, they rarely work with CX as a separate, isolated track. They don't have a department that just does
Because
CX.
you can't just do CX if the tracks don't connect.
Exactly. Instead, they are hired to solve actual practical problems. They are brought in when, say, an onboarding process is causing a massive drop-off in users, or when a customer support team is completely overwhelmed by easily avoidable technical tickets.
Real-world pain points.
Right. And they solve those practical problems by combining service design to fix the back-end handoffs and UX design to fix the front-end interfaces.
So CX isn't a task you do at the end of a project. It's not this final layer of polish you apply, and it's definitely not a distinct discipline that can be managed by one executive sitting in a boardroom drawing journey maps.
Exactly. The source concludes with a really powerful distinction. CX is not a discipline, it is an emergent result.
An emergent result. Wow, that completely flips the traditional mindset upside down.
It really does. A strong customer experience only emerges when the invisible structure of service design, the tangible interfaces of UX, and the people within the organization are all pulling in the exact same
It
direction.
all have to align.
Yeah, CX is the outcome of getting those other things right. Service design and UX design are not alternatives to CX. They are the literal, practical mechanisms that make a good CX possible.
You don't build a great customer experience by commanding it from the top down. You build it from the inside out by aligning the invisible structure with the visible touchpoints.
That's beautifully said.
Well, let's bring this all together for you, the listener. Good customer experience isn't magic. It isn't just a marketing promise or a buzzword thrown around in quarterly reports. It is the natural, inevitable byproduct of meticulously combining two distinct disciplines.
The backbone and the touch point.
Exactly. You need the invisible structural backbone of service design to make sure the internal pipes connect, and you need the highly tangible, user-facing touch points of UX design to make the interaction intuitive. When the tracks connect properly and the dining car is beautiful, the journey actually works.
That alignment is the secret. When those elements are unified, organizations can stop endlessly mapping the ideal experience and finally start building it.
Absolutely. Now, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. Think about your own life and the digital world you navigate constantly. The very next time you interact with a brand and you hit a wall, let's say you're navigating a beautifully designed, sleek mobile app, only to be suddenly dumped into a hopelessly confused, deeply unhelpful customer support chat.
It will happen, trust me.
Oh, it's inevitable. But when it does, I want you to pause and ask yourself a question. Ask yourself, am I just looking at a bad interface, or am I actually falling into the invisible gap between this company's organizational silos?
It definitely changes the way you look at every interaction, doesn't it? You start seeing the architecture behind the experience and the friction between the departments.
You really do. It makes you realize how much invisible machinery has to work perfectly just to make something feel simple. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the architecture of everyday experiences. We will catch you next time.